All right. We have this argument regularly, and I wanted to do a list of 10 goaltenders for key games. These are the 10 guys you want in a big game, and do a list of 10. And instead, I'm going to leave that up to you guys to make that decision. Because honestly, again, while I would have Patrick Roy at number 1, I'd have Hasek at number 2, and I'd have Brodeur at number 3. You can make an argument for a number of guys on this board. And then you can make an argument that the honorable mentions could very well be in the top 10. Your honorable mentions on this board, Mike Vernon, who had 2 Stanley Cup rings and had a Conn Smythe in there as well. Jean-Sebastien Giguère, who had a Cup ring and a Conn Smythe trophy. Braden Holtby, Cup ring for him in Washington. Excellent overall playoff numbers. Matt Murray, 2 Stanley Cup rings as a rookie. Jordan Binnington, as a rookie, wins the Stanley Cup last year, and I think showed he doesn't get nervous. Tom Barrasso, multiple Stanley Cups, and I have an asterisk next to Barrasso, Giguère, and Vernon because I really wanted them on the board. But at that point, you'd be at 13 goaltenders, and things would get really crowded on the board really quickly, and I want to keep this as simple as possible. So yeah, Barrasso for me was a key guy for that Pittsburgh. I'm not going to say dynasty because they only had the 2 Stanley Cups while he was there. Should have been a dynasty. 93 should have happened, but it didn't. But Barrasso, excellent overall playoff numbers and proved a lot of doubters wrong when he got to Pittsburgh. And Ken Dryden was before my time, but you kind of have to mention him in this, don't you? I mean, Ken Dryden and that Montreal dynasty. You can argue that they didn't need Dryden, but Dryden took a year off and proved they needed Dryden. And Bernie Perrant, he won Conn Smythes in 74 and 75 for the Philadelphia Flyers. So can't argue he wasn't a key guy because he really was. And then there's Roger Crozier, who won the first Conn Smythe trophy for a goaltender back in 1966. So lots of goaltenders that have had accolades over the years, and that we can all have the argument over who the greatest may or may not have been. And that's kind of where we're at for this one. So we're going to start with Marty Brodeur, because that's where I wanted to start. I went in kind of a random order with this, just to be honest. And then I got into a couple of guys from the 80s that I'm going to save for almost last. Almost last. Not quite, almost. Because I want to make a point with the last name on the board. So Marty Brodeur had 3 Stanley Cups in New Jersey. His regular season numbers are absolutely unassailable. You cannot argue against any of Marty Brodeur's numbers. You can argue the New Jersey Devils had some very good teams during that time. And it was kind of a good fortune thing. Anytime a guy gets a ton of wins, he's probably a good goaltender. He's also on a pretty good team. There have been plenty of goaltenders that haven't had great win-loss records in their career who've been excellent goaltenders. So wins is one of those things where if you're measuring all-time greatness in hockey, it's important, but it's not the end-all be-all. So 205 games played in the playoffs for Brodeur, 5,258 shots against overall. He faced 25.6 shots per game and had a save percentage of .919. The shots against per game is lower than most of the other guys on this board, and there will be those who will argue that New Jersey's trap definitely helped his numbers. And I've seen numerous sites over the years that talk about this, and it's definitely something that has been talked about. Now, I also think that the arguments against Brodeur sometimes get ridiculous. I think that there are times to make that argument, and there are times where it is a ridiculous argument to make. 24 shutouts in his career, and in 2003, you could argue that was his best overall year. 1.65 goals against average in the playoffs. 934 save percentage and 7 shutouts. 7, including, I believe it was 3 in the Stanley Cup Finals. Pretty solid Stanley Cup Finals for him. So Marty Brodeur's numbers are overall excellent. And for people who want to make the argument for Brodeur as the greatest of all time, I can't make an argument against it. At least that I think would be of any sort of... I don't think I can convince anybody otherwise who believes that. And that's just fine. For me, it would be Patrick Roy. He has 4 Stanley Cups. He had 2 in Montreal and 2 in Colorado. 247 games played in the playoffs. I don't think a goaltender ever even gets close to that again. I don't think we see another goaltender play 240 games in the playoffs. With parity being as it is, I just don't see it. 7,143 shots he faced. 918 save percentage. He faced 28.9 shots per game. Now, you could look at his save percentage and say, well, it's lower than a lot of other guys on the board. You'd be right. the argument can be made of, well, that was during a time, at the start, that was when there was more shots being taken and more goals going in. That would also be true. Patrick Roy, that run in 1986, he wins the Conn Smythe as a rookie goaltender. That's a pretty strong first piece of evidence on your resume to have, isn't it? 1993, he wins the Conn Smythe, unbeatable in overtime that year for the Montreal Canadiens. And then for Colorado in 2001, he wins a third Conn Smythe. Out of his 4 cup rings, he's the MVP first team 3 times. So, again, that's where, and the Conn Smythe might be one of those ones that we can argue about a lot. There certainly was a lot of argument that Phil Kessel should have won one when it went to somebody else for Pittsburgh, and arguments that maybe Malkin should have won one when one went to somebody else for Pittsburgh. So, right? And that's where the whole argument over the awards comes in as well. And we will always have that, for any award that's not just decided by straight statistics and math, you're going to have some subjective opportunities there to mess up the overall appearance of who should have been or might have been and could have been. Anyways, moving along from that, Dominik Hasek, 2 Stanley Cups for him. And one as a starter, one as the backup. Now, backup being that he was injured and Osgood kind of took over. And so we'll get to Osgood and Hasek and their time in Detroit. 119 games played in his Stanley Cup playoffs career. 3,283 shots, 925 save percentage, which is fantastic. 27.6 shots faced per game. I'm going to go ahead and guess that he faced more shots per game when he was in Buffalo's net than he did in Detroit's. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that's probably the case. 925 save percentage, 27.6 shots per game that he faced, and 14 shutouts. His overall numbers, excellent. Dominik Hasek drags Buffalo to a Stanley Cup Finals. I think if that final had gone to 7 games, Hasek probably wins the Conn Smythe Award. But again, that's where the argument comes in of all-time greats. In fact, there are definitely goaltenders who may not have a cup ring that we could talk about how great they were in the playoffs as well, and yet they're not up here. The all-time best save percentage in the playoffs actually belongs to Mike Smith. With goaltenders of a minimum of 15 games played in the playoffs, Mike Smith's actually the leader in save percentage in the playoffs. Who knew, right? Yeah. So, Hasek, one of the greatest, and to me, those would probably be the 3 greats during my time watching hockey. But I'm wearing a Jonathan Quick jersey for a reason. Jonathan Quick's run in 2012 was the most impressive run I've seen. 2 Stanley Cups, 85 games played, so he's played less games than almost everybody else on the board. Tim Thomas is the only one who's played less. 2,503 shots faced per game. Or, not per game. Recently it may feel like per game, right? 922 save percentage overall. Shots per game, 29.4 faced per game. That sounds a little more reasonable. So 9 shutouts for him overall. Again, he only played 85 games in the playoffs. It's not his fault the Kings didn't make the playoffs, and a lot of the years he didn't while he was there. 2012 Conn Smythe winner with a 946 save percentage. Absolutely fantastic run all the way through. It was like in Series 1 against Vancouver, he went, well, we're going to knock these guys out. And Vancouver tried to say something about it, but after 5 games they were done. And Jonathan Quick was on a mission, and it ended with a Stanley Cup ring for him. 2014, he wasn't as impressive, but still, 2 Stanley Cup rings, clutch goaltender, right? Absolutely. So if you want to argue Quick in the same realm with these guys, again, I can't really argue it. Chris Osgood, the one that doesn't get the respect on the board. 3 Stanley Cups, 2 of them as the starter, and 1 as the backup. 129 games played overall in the playoffs, which is pretty darn high. 3,185 shots faced. 916 save percentage. People know how I feel about Chris Osgood because I've already done a THG Hall of Fame video on Chris Osgood, and I've discussed many times over that I think Osgood's fantastic. 24.7 shots faced per game is the lowest number on the board. It is almost a full shot lower than Marty Brodeur. And that's an argument that could be made against Chris Osgood. The part that I find strange is, so he has 15 shutouts in 129 games. His numbers are not that different from Marty Brodeur's, and yet when you look at the overall numbers, people will say, well, Brodeur faced less shots, but they were really good shots. I've heard that from Devils fans, mostly. And yet, with Osgood, if you try to make that same argument, he was behind Detroit, come on. Well, how can you make the argument for one and not for the other? Because again, subjective stats, right? So it's a matter of picking and choosing. I see it a lot with advanced stats, and you see it with goaltenders a ton. A ton. That's why I'll say, for me, it's Patrick Roy is the greatest, but I can see the argument for others. Corey Crawford, 2 Stanley Cups in Chicago, and revered in Chicago, rightfully so. 87 games played, which is only 2 more than Jonathan Quick. 2,592 shots faced. 29.8 per game. So a little bit, almost a half a shot more faced per game by Crawford. 919 overall save percentage. I will agree that the defense he's played behind in Chicago, probably not as solid as the defense that Quick played behind in LA. But still, they faced more shots than most other goaltenders on the board. 5 shutouts for Corey Crawford. I can't really argue Crawford, though, into the same category as the other guys on the board. And yet, save percentage career, he's only 3 points behind Jonathan Quick. So, again, this is where things get kind of murky when you're trying to make the argument of who the greatest is. And this is why I'm doing this in this fashion rather than trying to count down 1 through 10. Because I couldn't do it. I'm like, well, I can't have this guy that low. So Tim Thomas, 1 Stanley Cup for him. 51 games played, and I think that's where making the argument of him as the greatest of all time, you can't. You can't. 51 games played in the playoffs. It's just too small a sample size. It's about a fifth of what Patrick Roy played. Now, if Thomas had been given a chance out of the gate, if he'd been playing in the league since he was 22, if he didn't have to wait till he was about 30 to get a legitimate shot, sure. He may very well be in that same category, but he's not. He's not in that category. 933 save percentage on the 1,602 shots he faced. 31.4 shots against per game. So he faced a lot of rubber. And this is where, when you point that out, people will say, yeah, but it was Boston, so a lot of those shots would have been from the outside. Because people can always make shots into anything they want. You didn't face enough shots. You faced a lot of shots, but those were from the outside. Well, yeah, he faced very few shots, but they were really good shots. Okay. 2011 Conn Smythe, he had 6 shutouts overall in his career and a 940 save percentage during that Conn Smythe run in 2011. You want to make the argument Thomas's run in 2011 is the greatest of all time? Awesome. You want to argue Jonathan Quick's run in 2012 was the best of all time? Great. I will agree those two were fantastic. For me, it was this. Tim Thomas had the greatest run I've ever seen of a goaltender in 2011, and then Jonathan Quick went, all right, hold my beer, I'll be right back. And he one-upped it. And that's how I see it. But again, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. And remember, you guys need to be subscribing if you're not subscribed already. Now, moving along, Billy Smith. So we're into the 80s guys that don't get the respect, right? The Rodney Dangerfields of goaltending are every goaltender who played in the 80s not named Patrick Roy, basically. 4 Stanley Cups for Billy Smith, 132 games played, 3,652 shots faced. 905 save percentage. People immediately say, well, the save percentage is too low. You can't put him in that same category. 27.6 shots faced per game. So it's relatively low compared to everybody else. But it's the same as Hasek, but his save percentage is 20 points lower. But people will also point out, and this is true, go look at any 80s game. Look at highlights. Defense? What is defense? Hold the guy up at the blue line. Why do I want to do that? It is stunning to try to watch. I can't watch games from the 80s now. I mean, I don't know how I did it back then. Because yeah, you're basically left yelling at the screen. Defense, where's the defense? Now, you also have to deal with the fact goaltenders look a lot smaller, like a foot and a half shorter than the guys that play now, and about a foot and a half narrower. But the 1983 Conn Smythe Trophy tells you Billy Smith was pretty good. And I could tell you from having watched hockey back then, Billy Smith was an excellent goaltender. Absolutely excellent goaltender, and he was one of the meanest goaltenders ever. So while Ron Hextall was a pretty mean goaltender as well, I think if I was gonna list most intimidating goaltenders, Billy Smith would probably be the tops among goaltenders I've seen in my lifetime. Just, yeah, or at least my time watching hockey. If I say my lifetime, people can be, where's Bernie Perron? Okay, Grant Fuhr, 4 Stanley Cups. Do I think he gets overrated at times? Yes. Was he also left fending for himself very often? Yes. 150 games played in the playoffs, 4,207 shots faced, 898 save percentage, which will absolutely decimate him in the eyes of many out there watching this. 28 shots against per game, a little bit more than Smith, less than Quick, about the same, or actually it's less than Patrick Roy as well. But again, Edmonton, there wasn't defense. As bad as things look if you watch an Islanders highlight reel, it's worse for the Oilers. You had 5 forwards on the ice most times with the Oilers. It was 5 forwards. Jumping into the play? Yes. Lee Fogelin, why aren't you jumping into the play? I'm a defensive defenseman. Yeah, we're going to have to get rid of you. Like, that's just kind of how things work for them. You're making everybody else look bad. Stop laying back. But Grant's all by himself back here. Don't worry, the other team's going to go see him soon. Now, Grant Fuhr had 6 shutouts in those 150 games, but shutouts were very rare in the 80s. Shutouts were a big deal in the 80s because they really didn't happen very often. And so Grant Fuhr, if you want to make the argument, played behind a porous defense, and in big games, he was a big game guy, and he got 4 Stanley Cups. That's why they got rid of Andy Moog. You can make that argument. Now, why did I save Marc-Andre Fleury for last? Marc-Andre Fleury is a really, really interesting case. 3 cups, 2 as the starter, including 2017 where he wasn't envisioned to be the starter, and he took over for Matt Murray. Now, what's interesting with Marc-Andre Fleury is he's flamed out in the first round more than once. And there were times during his run in Pittsburgh where he was seen as the weak link. He was seen as the reason that Pittsburgh wasn't getting over the hump more often than they were. 142 games played in the playoffs. That's a really high number. 4,176 shots faced. 911 save percentage overall. That overall save percentage is low comparatively speaking with a lot of the other guys on the board. 29.4 shots faced per game is the same as Jonathan Quick. He's 11 save percentage points below Jonathan Quick, though Quick has played about 60% of the games that Marc-Andre Fleury has in his career in the playoffs. 15 shutouts for Marc-Andre Fleury. The interesting thing for Fleury is when he's great, we saw in Vegas, he's fantastic. But as we saw in Pittsburgh during a couple of those runs, he can look very pedestrian at times. So it's really interesting with Marc-Andre Fleury. People will ask, like, well, do you think Fleury has a Hall of Fame career? Absolutely. I think the run in Vegas has solidified him as probably a first ballot Hall of Famer. But he has also looked terrible on occasions in Pittsburgh. He has had very pedestrian seasons and postseasons that just weren't good. So Marc-Andre Fleury to me is the most interesting name on the list because Brodeur was solid all the way through. Patrick Waugh had some brain farts, especially towards the end there, some brain farts, right? I got it. Don't do the around the world. Oh, you did. You dropped it. Don't worry about it. It's in the net. Dominik Hasek was excellent all the way through his career in the playoffs. Jonathan Quick, finding a bad playoff for him is difficult. Osgood, yeah, you can probably find a couple of times where you can point to Detroit's not winning the Stanley Cup and maybe point a finger at Osgood. I will admit there were times where Detroit failed and people would look at Osgood and say he's not good enough. They need to upgrade. Corey Crawford, at times, he's had his challenges in the playoffs. Tim Thomas was pretty excellent throughout. Billy Smith, the last year when he won that Conn Smythe in 83, there were some rumblings that Rolly Melanson should have been the goaltender. And I might have been making some of them myself, even as a kid. Grant Fuhr, again, you can have that argument that he had some bad playoffs mixed in with some really good ones. But Marc-Andre Fleury is a fascinating name on the board and had to get into the top 10. So again, Vernon, Giguère, Holtby, Murray, Binnington, Barrasso, and Dryden all get honorable mentions. Dryden's the only one on there that wasn't one that I watched with my own eyeballs because I came into watching hockey after he'd retired, and Bernie Parent and Roger Crozier have to be on the board. Crozier, the first to win the Conn Smythe as a goaltender, and Bernie Parent, the 74 and 75 Conn Smythes. So here's the question. You have a Game 7 Stanley Cup final. You're into Game 7. Okay, now people are going to say, what about Mike Richter? Richter could, if I'm going to get into Richter, then the honorable mentions get Javi Bulin in there as well, and then the whole board is filled with goalie names. I wanted to keep it simple. But if you have a Game 7 situation, and you get to use one of these 10 guys on the board, who's your starting goaltender for that Game 7? And they're all in their prime. It's not now. They're all in their prime. Who is your number one guy in a Game 7? For me, it's Patrick Waugh, and that's why, for me, Patrick Waugh is still the best clutch goaltender I've seen. But I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, as I suggested earlier in the video, if you haven't already. And hey, thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.